12 people sat assembled around the huge oak table, none of them happy to be there. Jury duty was the last activity any of them wanted to participate in. Many of those gathered had jobs to be at or trips they wanted to take, but here they all were, bored, annoyed, and ready to go home. The door at the back of the room swung open, and a man in a dusty-looking gray suit came in with a cart meticulously organized with binders. He didn't say anything to the jury members as he handed them each a binder with copies of the case information in it. Not until he had placed the card against the wall and set up a projector connected to a computer on a desk did he bother to speak. "My name is Marshall Collins," he introduced himself, his voice sounding dusty as well. His face seemed a little ashen, like he'd seen a lot of things recently to make him question his view of the world. He cleared his throat. "As you all know, this is a very sensitive case. I understand everyone has been briefed already, but I want to reiterate that this is going to be very, very different from the type of case you may have been expecting." This information had everyone around the table sitting up a little straighter. "We were told it was the case for all those kids who went missing," one woman in her mid-40s said quietly. Marshall nodded his head. "That it is." "Well, let's get this underway then," an older white man with a bulbous stomach and trucker hat bellowed. "I want to convict the bastard child killer and get him on death row ASAP." "You may want to save your enthusiasm for a few moments," Marshall sighed. "Why? Any scumbag with enough evidence against them to start a trial over is guilty as shit, in my opinion. I don't even know why we're wasting time here looking at the proof instead of just voting him guilty and throwing his ass away," the overweight man stated, with his arms crossed over his chest and a scowl on his face. "On top of that," a young black woman cut in quietly, "why is all of this being kept so hush-hush? No news crews, no courtroom trial, no one from the public allowed to watch the proceedings? It's kind of weird, Mr. Collins." 12 faces questioned him at once. Some were openly curious, some confused, a couple looked a little hostile. With a sigh, Marshall clicked something on his computer, pulling up a picture of a young red-haired girl on the projector. The suspect is 8-year-old Alicia Lazarus. She was the last person seen with all 8 children who have gone missing in a 3-month period. "Oh, that is a joke," the belligerent man said, sounding a little bit like a toddler on the edge of a tantrum as he shoved his folder away and stood up. "I came here to work on a real case, not some nonsense about a little girl. Where the hell is the real culprit?" Marshall clicked the computer again, bringing up a video to the screen. "I can assure you this isn't a joke, sir. Unfortunately, this case is very serious, and before I present you with any evidence we have, I need to ask everyone to steady their nerves. This whole ordeal is going to be very taxing, confusing, and will take a lot of careful consideration on everyone's part." The belligerent man sat back down, making a show of getting comfortable in his chair with his arms crossed behind his head. The look on his face challenged Marshall to prove himself. Many of the others exchanged confused glances among themselves, but no one spoke up. Once everyone had settled in, Marshall cleared his throat. "This case isn't going to be public. Everything needs to stay very quiet, and we need to get it worked out quickly on top of that," he stated. "We owe the parents of those missing kids justice, but we also have to consider the fragile nature of our accused. The first bit of evidence I have for you is a compilation of video footage from a CCTV camera from R&R's barbecue across the street from the park where all the victims were last seen. In these videos, you can clearly see the accused walking alone with each victim in the direction of a jogging trail on the other side of the park." Marshall clicked a few times before the footage began playing. Each of the 7 separate videos showed a very clear picture of the little red-haired girl walking to the right with other children. In most of the scenes, she was only with one other child, but in one she was with 2 at a time. They would walk in from the left of frame, cross, and exit the right side of the camera view. None of the kids with her seemed nervous or scared. They looked like normal little kids heading off to walk the wooded trails that were popular for the joggers and families in town. These videos are some of the last known evidence of the victims and shows Miss Lazarus as the last person to see them all alive, Marshall informed the group. So, what? A young, maybe 19-year-old Asian man spoke up. Do we think she was luring them out to do something? The young black woman perked up. There's a bluff in the far back of those trails that overlooks where the creek curves towards the river. Maybe she pushed the kids off? Is the creek fast enough to wash the bodies away, though? A middle-aged, blonde white woman asked. I thought divers already went down there and didn't find anything. Marshall nodded to the theorists. Yes, divers have checked the creek. Teams have gone miles along the banks to search for any sign of the kids having been in the water. But no evidence has been found. There have been no remains found for reasons you will soon understand. Well, there was that flash flood in June, the belligerent man offered. That was right before the last kid, so maybe that washed the bodies out farther than they could search. As much as he disliked the man, Marshall had to keep himself from snapping at him. Police and search parties have been called off in light of recent evidence that you will be shown shortly. Just please be patient, Marshall replied. He clicked again and a new video file pulled up. This is the interrogation of Miss Lazarus, conducted by child psychiatrist Dr. Galson with Officer Tallis sitting in. The video was a standard, boring shot typical of police interviews. There was the little girl, suggested to be a killer, seated at the table with a male psychiatrist seated across from her. Alicia, I'm Dr. Galson. I'm like the counselor from your school, the man said as an introduction. I'm here to talk to you about some other kids you've met recently. Alicia sat in her chair, very still, and seemed to keep her eyes steadfastly on the doctor. What about them? Well, to start, tell me how you met them, Mr. Galson asked. The little girl didn't fidget the way a normal child would. She didn't swing her feet, play with her hair, twiddle her fingers, bite her nails. She didn't bashfully look away from the adult. Her body stayed eerily still, her gaze directed at her interrogator. I met them at the park. The park by your house? She nodded. Yes, sir. Her voice showed, even through the grainy audio quality of the police video, that she was not nervous. How did you pick out which kids you wanted to play with? I didn't play with them. Most of them were smelly and gross, and I didn't really want to be around them. I picked the fat kids, though. Why did you pick the overweight children? Dr. Galson questioned. 'Cause those ones fill her up best. The doctor was shown to pause for a full 5 seconds before noting her response. What do you mean by fill her up? The fat kids are big enough to keep her from getting too hungry before I can feed her again, Alicia answered. It sounded almost as if she thought this was too obvious to have to explain. Who were you feeding, Alicia? Is there an animal in the woods you were taking care of? Dr. Galson asked. Alicia shook her head. No, she isn't an animal. There aren't any animals big enough to eat people on that trail, Doctor. My parents said that there's nothing bigger than squirrels out there. Who is she then, Alicia? Who were you feeding? There's a ghost lady from the woods where the trail gets close to my backyard. She likes to hide out in my treehouse. She's always hungry, and the only thing she eats is kids, because she's been sick for a long time and needs to get better. She was too sick to get them herself, so I would bring her kids to eat, Alicia answered. Did the ghost lady threaten you into doing this? Did she say she would eat you if you didn't bring her other children? Alicia shook her head, finally moving for the first time, cocking her head to the side. I offered to bring them. I don't want her to go away, so I fed her. She promised to never eat me because I'm too little and sick to be good to eat. What do you mean by that? Are you sick, Alicia? Dr. Galson questioned, shooting a glance at Officer Tallis for the first time the whole interview. No one has told us that you aren't well. Yeah, she says I've got this thing in my brain called a tumor, Alicia replied, pointing at a spot near the front of her head on the left side. She said eating me would only get her a little bit of time, but that she would be my best friend and show me how to get better if I brought her enough kids to make her all better first. Who is she, Alicia? Dr. Carlson asked, leaning a little over the table with his fingers steepled. She's just the lady in my treehouse. I don't know her name. Could you show us where the other kids are? The ones you took to her. Their parents really miss them and want them to come home, Dr. Carlson coaxed. The little girl shook her head. They got eaten. There isn't anything left of them to go home. She ate them all up. Could you introduce us to her? We would like to meet her and be friends with her too. I'm sure that if she really is sick, that she needs help, and we would love to get her the help she needs, Officer Tallis asked. His tone was fatherly, tender even. She shook her head. When she spoke again, her voice was cracking from the tears starting to roll down her pale, round cheeks. I can't. She ran away after the last kid got away from her. I haven't seen her at all since then. The little girl pulled her legs up into the chair and buried her face into her knees. Her sobs were heart-wrenching to hear, even with the bad audio quality. The video ended, leaving the jurors very confused. She's insane, the old, overweight man from earlier announced. Open and shut case. I think you're all insane. She's a little girl. There is no way a little girl can go killing people. She's simply not big enough to do any damage, the middle-aged woman said, objecting to the whole situation. What about the ghost person she said she was feeding the kids to? Has anyone searched for her? She seems to be the real culprit in this and just used little Alicia as a lure to get the other kids, the black woman questioned. The Asian man cut in. How about that treehouse? Anything going on with it? Marshall raised his hands to quieten the most talkative of them down. Yes. Search parties have been looking for the ghost woman Alicia was talking about. She described the woman as a flat white lady shape without a face or hair. It's a bit hard to look for something like that, but it's suspected that it was a woman wearing one of those full-body morph suits. In regards to the treehouse, it has been scrutinized from top to bottom. Every nook, cranny, and splinter went over with a magnifying glass. There was plenty of evidence that DNA matched back to the children who went missing. Several of the adults before him looked ill. Evidence? The Asian man asked with a bit of a drawn tone. The gray man nodded. If you'll open your folders, you can see photos of what was found inside Alicia's treehouse. No one looked eager to open the binders. They exchanged glances, each seemingly waiting on someone else to go first. After a few moments of silence, the belligerent man huffed and threw the cover to his folder open. The others followed his lead to the detriment of a few of their better judgments. The first photo was of a small, white, round table with a tiny porcelain tea set. There were 2 small chairs on either side with cookies, water, and a little vase of faux flowers. It would have been cute if not for the huge, dark spray of long coagulated blood covering the pristine paint. The dirtiest side of the table was splattered, as if to suggest it had dripped from the mouth of someone eating too quickly. Many of the jurors' faces became confounded. No one said anything, which Marshall took as a blessing. He didn't want to talk about the case any more than required. This next picture is more graphic, and if anyone is squeamish, I highly suggest to steel yourselves. Marshall wasn't exaggerating. The next photo was an on-scene shot of a blender sitting on the floor. Scraps of dried, jerky-like flesh were visibly caught in the blades of the appliance. Dark, dried blood coating the plastic. It was immediately met with sickened noises from the jurors. That's foul, a woman who had stayed silent until then said, trying not to gag. This is evidence from a murder scene, Marshall said dully. You can't have been expecting candy and bunnies. The flesh has been tested and came back belonging to Margaret Collins, age 12, the 4th child to go missing. Maybe she cut the girl up first and tried to liquefy her, the young black woman offered. Her dark face looked to have paled a bit, and her voice had a tiny shiver to it. You don't think Alicia ate any of those kids herself, do you? The middle-aged woman questioned. She was a shade of pale green that hinted she may soon be sick. Feeling ill himself, Marshall replied, "We can say for certain that she did. The only DNA found in the appliance was from Marshall Collins, indicating she was the only one to be used in it." You said there was evidence from all the kids in there earlier, the overweight man challenged. With a shake of his head, Marshall answered that challenge. Right, I did, but it wasn't all in the blender. There were traces of blood, hair, and a few fragments of bone discovered inside the treehouse that could be traced back to every child Alicia was seen leading away from the park. Are there more photos like this? The older man from earlier inquired after a long silence. He wasn't looking so pompous anymore. He didn't look too put off, but the edge he'd had earlier was gone. Yes, Marshall said apologetically. Can we skip anything else like this? The gory crap isn't settling well, the man spoke, the other people nodding their agreements. Marshall met eyes with the man. We're here to judge the case of this young girl, sir. We can't do her the dishonesty of leaving ourselves ignorant of any details. Is there any other evidence we can look at as a break, then? The younger black woman questioned. Marshall shook his head, moving the mouse around. Unfortunately, no. It just gets worse, I'm afraid. As it turns out, Adkin Lazarus had an entire slew of home security cameras installed in every room of his home, including his daughter's treehouse. There is video footage of what transpired with each and every child Alicia lured there, as well as her own cannibalistic attempts with Margaret Collins and the blender. The new video seemed to be set in an upper corner of the treehouse. It caught every part of the tiny room, but the table was best in view. From a little opening in the floor emerged Alicia and another little girl about her own age, but who was easily 30 pounds heavier. There was no audio, but clearly they were speaking. Alicia guided the other girl to the little white table and gestured to her to take a seat. No one seemed too disturbed by this. They watched Alicia sit down and pour water from the little teapot into her playmate's cup, offering a cookie and eating one herself. In the farthest corner of the room, a white form began to take shape. Alicia visibly brightened with excitement as the figure became more solid, though like a white shadow instead of a true thing. It straightened up to show a vaguely human form before making its way to the table. The chubby little girl seated opposite Alicia seemed to pick up on the change in attitude, her round face scrunching up in confusion. Just as she turned to look behind her, the white thing opened a mouth that gaped from its face to its pelvis and swallowed the little girl whole. The white shape stretched and wavered, blood drooling down its legs in tiny rivulets to splatter the floor as its entire body chewed and swallowed. Marshall turned the video off in disgust. He felt bile in the back of his throat and did his best to keep it down as he faced his shocked audience. Is anyone interested in seeing the other 8 videos from the Bevan security system at this time, or should we break for lunch and resume later? The case only took 2 days to come to a decision and issue the verdict of not guilty by reason of mental instability. There was little else they could feasibly do. Alicia's guilt was questionable in regards to her age, but there was no doubt that she willingly fed other children to their deaths, and took part in cannibalism and desecration of a corpse. They couldn't formally charge her due to her age, but no juror felt safe letting someone still potentially dangerous out among her peers. Alicia was sent to a children's psychiatric ward. She wouldn't be eligible for release until her 18th birthday. Her family was torn by the decision, but it was better than possibly setting her loose on more children. Many of those who had worked on the case required therapy once the whole ordeal was over. Marshall himself resigned from his position in pursuit of a more natural working environment.